My name is Monk Rowe, and I'm very privileged to be speaking with Dave Brubeck today in his home in Wilton, Connecticut. Thank you for taking time out of your day with me.
Good title, Time Out.
That's true. I wonder if that was subliminal. It's a real pleasure to be here and look around your room and all the history, and you go back so far, and I really feel a need to congratulate you on this career that is ongoing and very important in American music.
Yeah, I'm busier now than I ever was and ever expected to be, because every day it seems to get worse demands and to finish stuff. And these rooms are full of unfinished projects that I'd like to do.
I recently read a little article that I think came from, you were in San Diego recently, weren't you?
Yeah.
And someone quoted you as saying, if you could finish all the work you had, you'd be very happy.
Yeah. Right.
When you compose, was it Stravinsky who said something about composing is selective improvisation?
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with the way you write? Probably.
It's an interesting book, the Stravinsky Poetics of Music. And that's, I think, one of the most important sentences that a young musician should really look at and try and digest, because selective improvisation, composition is selective improvisation. Mm-hmm. And that connects the composer and the jazz musician in a wonderful way, in that it's the same kind of mindset that plays jazz as composes and writes music, but you haven't got time to be selective. You have to move to the next note in a split second. Mm-hmm. And in composition, you can stop and go have lunch or put it away for a few years. Uh-huh. So it's selective, but it's the same kind of thinking, only on a quicker level.
Yeah, you can go back and edit things that you might have done on the spot.
Yeah.
You liked part of it, perhaps.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If I was to look at an orchestral score and look down the page vertically, do you think in chordal structure when you write these days?
Well, usually I first think of a melodic line, mm-hmm. and then I harmonize it. And I have to write on the road in airplanes and trains and buses and cars, and then I check it later.
At the piano to see if...
Yes, to see if I'm close to right. Mm-hmm. And I know that my teacher, Darius Mio, never had to check anything and never had to be near a piano. And like a Mozart, his mind worked. Just some kind of perfection that God gave a few people. Mm-hmm. Stravinsky always wrote at the piano.
That's interesting. The ideas that you've had in jazz, the polytonality and polyrhythmic, do you try to get those into your orchestral pieces also?
Always, yeah. Always. They're always floating around there.
Uh-huh. I had a couple excerpts here, and that are separated by about 35 years, I think. And maybe we can just listen to the tail end of this one.
Elementals.
Right. You said you wrote that right in this room?
I finished it here. Uh-huh. Started it in another house on the other side of town.
I see.
Most of it was written right here.
You know, this the part right there sounds rather angry to me.
Oh, it's really just A, B, C. Because I wanted it to be simple as A, B, C.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted it in 3 sections. So the first section's in A, second section in B, and the last section in C. And
That's really interesting. Maybe just the intervals
yeah.
that sound, plus everybody, you know. in
Well,
unison.
by spreading that interval, it makes it, instead of the one of the most used intervals, or like the A minor scale or something, all of a sudden it becomes dissonant by skipping up a ninth.
Yeah. If we skip ahead to this piece. Dance for Joy.
Where'd you ever get that?
George sent it to me.
Oh, because that's the only performance of that piece with the Hartford Symphony. That's the premiere of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if in the time between Elementals and this piece, I would think your skill at orchestrating and arranging for a large ensemble has changed. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I've learned a lot. I started with Elementals, was the first time. My brother informed me that he wasn't going to do any more orchestration for me. And Ray Wright asked me to write this piece that we would do in Rochester at Eastman School of Music. And I said, I haven't ever written anything for orchestra. And he said, well, I can hear in your music that your thinking is like a big orchestra. Well, I had to agree with him because I do think sometimes with both hands full of notes.
I'm glad to hear you say that because sometimes when I listen to you play, I feel like your 2 hands are like a big band.
Yeah, that's right. So he said, well, you go ahead and write it and indicate what you think would be good orchestration. So I wrote the first movement, indicated the orchestration, and he came back to me and said, your instincts are right, and I'll follow those indications. And why not on the next movement, you just orchestrate it. And if there's anything that's impossible, I'll tell you. And then he said, no, everything is possible. And when we got to the third movement, he said, there's going to be some French horn players remember you for a long time. But he said, it is playable. And he got the best players in New York, studio players, all name guys, because Ray Wright was well respected by all the musicians, and he just could call them. For years, he was the orchestrator and arranger at Radio City Music Hall. So every week, not every week, but most weeks, he'd have a new show, and it'd have to be ready to go, no mistakes, and just he was kind of perfect.
Uh-huh.
And so he was a perfect guy to go to Rochester and teach at Eastman,
Yeah.
teach orchestration, composition. And he was the perfect guy to get me going. It worked out wonderfully.
I think you called that a concerto for anyone who can afford an orchestra. Oh, my. Yes, there's that one beautiful line in there. I think the French horns do a boo-da-da,
Yeah.
boo-wee. Oh, that's just gorgeous. Do you find that in gaining more knowledge about how things work, and is it restrictive at all for you? Because you have said that it's good to be an innocent.
Yeah.
Do you,
I have not got the capability to study like other guys. It has to be by osmosis or just some other way.
mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of my friends that work that way that have turned out great music. Mm-hmm. That don't read well and haven't studied a lot, but write so beautifully. And there might be something to acknowledge that if a person doesn't have the usual skills, don't count him out. He might have something else going on that are unusual because they aren't the usual.
Okay.
And in my experience, some of my favorite musicians didn't have reading skills or orchestrating skills, had to pick it up in their own way, and have contributed maybe more than anybody else. So there's something. I'll tell you, Ellington wasn't the greatest reader. Did you know that?
I'd heard that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Neither was Louis Armstrong.
Mm-hmm.
And Garner, who was one of my favorites, was he didn't know about reading. Didn't need to know and didn't care. So how did he develop? Yeah. You know, just he was perfection. And Art Tatum. There's never been anybody yet with his ability, right. And yet he was a person that didn't read, he just heard and mm-hmm. produced and wrote. Not wrote, he played.
Yeah.
And he had command of the harmonic and rhythmic ideas more than anybody I've ever known.
Yeah.
Then there's people like George Shearing that is amazing. He's learned through rote and through Braille and combined everything. That's one of the most amazing guys I know is Shearing. The way he refuses to be in any way defeated. Some way he's more organized than most people I've ever known.
Yeah. Well, when you go to compose a new piece, does it usually come from a commission that has some guidelines for what they want? A subject area, perhaps?
In some cases, yeah. The piece I wrote for the Pope, they gave me a sentence, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the jaws of hell cannot prevail against it." So I decided I couldn't do that, that they wanted 9 minutes while the Pope entered the stadium in San Francisco, Candlestick Park. Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't have enough text to do 9 minutes. And then I went to bed, dreamt the subject and counter subject of a fugue, and I knew how to do it, how Bach would have done it. He'd take a sentence and make it last a while. And so I did a chorale and fugue on that sentence, and I got a second sentence from the Bible. I said, give me one more sentence. And they decided they'd give me the next sentence. It was in keeping what they wanted.
Okay.
What is bound on earth shall be bound in heaven, and what is loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. So I had those two sentences.
If you were to start a new piece, even though you've got so much to finish, of your own choosing, is it possible to say where your inspiration might come from?
I was working on one this morning already, and I'll try to complete it today. And it's really coming from the war that's going on now in Afghanistan. And the prediction of Christ just before he was crucified. And I had my wife look at it today, and she said, you don't want anybody to sing that. It's too sad. And I said, well, I am sad. And this is what I'm doing.
Uh-huh.
And she said, I don't think people will want to hear that. And so I thought it over. And I said, well, I've written other sad things. They're not all happy. And that didn't bother you. She said, but this is too sad. It's Luke chapter 23, I think, verse 18 and 19. And it's Christ on his way to the cross, where he's telling the women of Jerusalem to be fortunate if you don't have children and you're barren. You remember that section in the Bible? I don't know if anybody was stupid enough to set it like I am today.
Yeah.
And how the mountains will fall on you. Well, look what's going on. You know?
Yeah.
Here's the prediction of it.
Oh my.
And so I'm setting that, and
Yeah.
and maybe I'll never give it to anybody.
Right. But whether or not people want to hear something is not usually your goal about writing, is it? I mean, you're thinking this, and so you write it.
I'll do that, and if no one, maybe I won't send it to anybody. It'll just be around the house.
Right.
Or maybe there'll come a time when I think it's right to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I'd written one piece, a setting of Robert Penn Warren, and there came a time when it was right to do that, and it was for the soldiers that had fought in the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
It ends up, the last sentence is, truth is for the grave. Now that's a pretty sad thing. I said to my wife, remember that piece? Mm-hmm. Remember how it worked? We did it with the veterans in New York.
Yeah.
And she said, well, but this is telling people not to have children. Christ saying, it doesn't say not to have children, but you wish you didn't have children. It's going to be so bad. So in some ways, when I do something like this, I'm trying to tell people that would take something like this serious, that if they don't take it serious, this is what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. There's only one way out. And in my religious pieces, I've often said the way out. And this one is so desperate. But it might make people think about the way out. And it's simple, but absolutely impossible. In The Light in the Wilderness, the center of that piece is love your enemies, do good to those that hate you. Now, this is probably the most important thing Christ said. Mm-hmm. And if we'd only listen, there's only one way out of this mess that gets progressively worse. It's to love your enemy and help them. Mm-hmm. Now, we're coming the closest to that outside of the Marshall Plan in World War II, but that was when the war was over. Right. To jump in and do what Christ suggested before it becomes too late. Uh-huh. And then my next piece, The Gates of Justice, the center of that piece is Martin Luther King saying, we must live together as brothers or die together as fools. Again, one sentence tells you how you got to act. And then I'll start talking about this and saying, we should have done so much more. I was in Afghanistan. President Eisenhower sent us behind the Iron Curtain in 1958. We went first to Poland, then to Turkey, Afghanistan, the periphery of Russia, Iran, Iraq, East and West Pakistan, India, and so on. And on my mind is, we've got to get together. And I wrote a lot of music hoping that some of it would help us get together. Mm-hmm. And I still keep trying.
Yeah. In this current situation we're in now, with different philosophies and different religions involved, can you see a way to best resolve what's going on?
Yeah, but we've waited so long that hatred is so entrenched, mm-hmm. and false explanation to all the religious groups of what the religion really stands for. Mm-hmm. If you got to the basis of, for instance, Buddha, 600 years before Christ, said the crowning enlightenment is to love your enemy. And that may be where Christ picked that up. And when Malcolm X went to Mecca, he changed his whole philosophy when he got back to the United States. He said, we're all going in, not all, but we're stating a lot of things that aren't true about Islam. And he was silenced for being a peacemaker.
Yeah, trying to change the course of what some of his other people wanted. Yeah.
And so was Martin Luther King, mm-hmm. and so was Christ. And it's got to come from the grassroots up. And when I was in these countries, I used to be appalled by the lies constantly going on the air about the United States. And right today, it's going on. There's so many great things they could say about us, mm-hmm. and show what we're trying to do in Afghanistan. But they don't show that. They show always the death of some children, which is terrible, and they show always the negative. We should have been investing so much. You see, the Voice of America was so appreciated, but there should have been far more of that type of thing. Because I know, I've been to Russia 3 times, that at the risk of death, people were listening to the Voice of America. And it came on every night out of Washington with Willis Conover. And he played mostly jazz. And the average Russian, when he speaks English, sounds like Willis Conover. And they called it Jazz and Bones because in the hospitals, they took the plates of X-ray and they could cut a record from the broadcast. And the bones would still be seen there. Well, and also, if you were caught with one of those so-called discs, X-ray plates, that'd be the end of you. Yet they took those chances. The nurses and the doctors would secretly listen. And we've been to secret meetings in places like Poland. The last thing they said to me was just before we came home we were in the basement of a hotel, about 60 people in the jazz club. And one fellow stood up and said he wanted to give a toast. And he said, when you go home, remember, we want freedom as much as you do. Well, those things aren't popular in those days. So you had to hide. And I've seen so many things where people were so pro-America, but it was so dangerous to be.
Very interesting. I hadn't heard a lot of that. Regarding your choral work, if you could pick a section of a particular piece that you felt really came together as far as the way the text was set and the orchestration and the whole thing that resounded the best for you, is there a moment, a favorite of yours?
There's moments in almost all of the pieces. And for instance, we're going to do the Christmas cantata at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York. I think this will be the 15th year. Once we did 11 years in a row, and then there was a new minister and new choral director, and we skipped a few years, but we were there last year and this year. And that has a happy ending. That when I finished the cantata, I was in the back of a Volkswagen bus where I had a card table. My wife was driving, and we were going up to see our youngest son, who was in a music camp in Vermont. And I said, I've finished. And she's driving along. And she said, no, you haven't. You haven't finished. And I said, why? She said, because we've left out the most important thing about Christmas. And I said, well, what is that? And she said, God's love made visible. And I said, well, that just doesn't fit. I can't hear any way to set that. So she said, well, try, see what you can do, because we've got to end the piece with that. So pretty quick I said, Iola, it's perfect in 5. God's love made visible, he is invincible. So this was summer, and we were offered a ski cabin to stay in near this music camp called Kinhaven. My son, the youngest son, went there year after year. He loved it. And so when we got to it was an A-frame ski chalet, kind of small, but 3 stories. Up on the top floor was a piano, which I was glad to have, but all the Christmas decorations from the year before were all up there, all over this room. So I got into the Christmas spirit and finished that in the middle of summer up there.
That's a great story.
Yeah, that's how things happen.
Yeah.
You don't plan them.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of times you don't plan them, they just happen.
Right. I think, didn't Mel Torme and his partner write the Christmas song in the middle of July, too?
Yeah.
Sitting by a swimming pool.
Yeah.
But it sounds like Mrs. Brubeck has been a very valuable sounding board and partner
Yeah.
in all respects.
Except this morning,
When she
when
looked
she
at you,
doesn't like my new piece. Because she usually likes everything, and will give me suggestions.
right?
But she said, don't let anybody sing that. That's too sad.
Oh my. Well, you can't fault her for her honesty, I guess.
No.
It's very interesting. The piece you're working on now, or the pieces, is it choral in nature or orchestral?
Oh,
Too much.
there's one of the last things I wrote was, the Brodsky String Quartet?
Yes.
They just recorded my string quartet. Have you got that?
Yes, I do.
Well, they asked me to do a piece that they're doing. The last time they did a piece like this, they made about $1,200,000 for the poor, and they gave through the BBC. They gave all the money, and they do kind of far out things. So they're doing Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and they're asking all kinds of composers to contribute their version of Ode to Joy. You know who Tom Waits is?
Yes.
Well, he's done it for Drainpipe.
He's done it to be played on
On
a
the
drain.
Drainpipe. And so various composers are doing this thing. So they asked me to do it, and I thought, oh, that's sacrilege. The Ode to Joy? And so, I don't always accept things. I say, oh, I don't want to do that. And then I think about it because it won't leave my mind. And I thought, boy, it's perfect in 5/4 time. Down, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the second theme, down, down, dee, dum, dum, da, dee, dee, dum, bum, dum, dee, dee, dum, bum, dum, bum, dum. So they're not waiting for the broadcast. They're using it for an encore now.
Really?
They said it works so well.
Isn't that so interesting when your first reaction is, oh, please.
Yeah.
But I can just see the way you must work. It's like it gets in there
Yeah.
and something starts stirring around.
And then just before that, a solo violinist named Simon Blendes. Blendis, said he's taking Bach Partita, and it's, I think, 6 movements, and he's asking 6 composers to write a section after each composer. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm thinking, oh, I don't want to get involved in this. And I did it, and he's played it. I went to the performance. All 6 composers were in London, wow. And we all had to go on stage. But I did the bourrée, mm-hmm. And the Gigue, I think, was the last movement, and I loved what the composer did with that. I liked mine, but I liked his better. Uh-huh. And he's an Irish composer, and he got into Irish Gigue fiddle stuff, mm-hmm. And it really worked. It was just a natural. But these are the kind of things. Now, that'll probably be recorded this year. Mm-hmm. Then a group called Pietà, after the Palestrina orphan girls. You remember that? Palestrina
he took the orphans.
Orphan girls. Yes. Mm-hmm. And he made such great musicians out of them that they were always called on. And it supported the orphanage. Mm-hmm. And great music was written for those girls. And they became great musicians. So there's a group in Canada, all girls, all women, and they asked me to write them a piece. And they call themselves Pietà. And they were going to be performing at the Montreal Jazz Festival, and would I write a piece? So that's a recent piece, and it's called Regret. Very sad piece. Mm. And just for all strings, but it'll work for string quartet too. It'll work for just one of each. And they played it live at the festival, and the jazz audience loved it. Mm-hmm. The year before, we did our mass at the jazz festival and had a standing ovation. We just did the mass in Vienna, Munich, and East Berlin. And I was afraid in English to do a mass in these countries that are so revered for music. They applauded the Lord's Prayer. They applauded all the way through this piece. And got 3 standing ovations in one country in the middle of the Mass.
Boy, that's exciting.
Yeah. Yesterday we found out we're not doing my Easter cantata in Vienna. Uh-huh. Which was very disappointing to Russell Gloyd, our conductor. Mm. But he said, well, then we'll record it with the London Symphony Orchestra. I'm trying to make up my mind whether to do the Easter cantata, which is called Beloved Son, or Tongues of Fire, which is about after Christ comes back and fire descends on the disciples and they all speak in tongues and everything. That's a very different kind of cantata, and I think it's only been performed once. Yeah. And to me, it's so wild because I had a friend of mine that lived here in Wilton that was a linguist. So I said, each man speaking in his own tongues, are they not all Galileans? How can they do this, in Greek and in the language Christ used was what was used in Jerusalem, and Persian and Macedonian. So he investigated, and I said, just give me each one of these languages. He said, well, I don't know. Some of these are ancient, Sanskrit, and he said, but I know professors all over the country. I'll write to them all. So those little things in that piece just knocked me out, because the choir's got to sing in all these languages. It's just one line that they have to sing in all the different languages.
Yeah.
Something like, he was the Son of God, or a simple line. But it's full of the sounds of the Middle East. And also where not a lot of other composers have already done a work. It's so hard to do an Easter cantata where the conductor and the choir can pick many great versions.
Yeah.
So this one, I'm kind of in free territory.
Yeah. A recent quote that you had about a CD of yours called The Crossing, you said it's so important to have this message of freedom going all over the world. That prophetic, I think, even more important these days, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And, well, we're confronted with that right now in this war in Afghanistan. And we are, to me, the country with the most freedom, and an example for why does everyone want to come here?
Yeah.
And, I've traveled so much in almost every country in the world. And there are times when we're hated, but they don't ever seem to hate jazz.
Yeah.
Of course, you're getting a minority of people. But the idea of freedom, if there's a dictator or a dictatorship, the first thing they're going to stop is jazz. Absolutely. Hitler stopped it immediately. Stalin stopped it. I think it just gives the country, the people of a country, too much idea of what it would be like to be free. And you see, that's the way jazz started, was the African American getting freedom, being denied freedom. And it still goes back to those roots of getting freedom. And people just don't realize how little freedom there was. Some people weren't allowed to speak, but they would sing maybe or hum. Some way they'll get through. In Poland, people that weren't Catholic all started tipping their hats when they went by a Catholic church. Eventually, this grew and grew, and of course they are mostly Catholic, but it just grew where you couldn't stop that. I wrote a piece where it has a long section called Bow Down. And it just goes over and over, bow down, to this great sacrament, all bow down. And one critic in England said, how can you bow down to a sacrament? Well, you can. It was done. And still being done. Just this idea of that sacrament. And when we did the Mass in Russia, and it was on Russian television maybe 5 years ago, till all the old satellite countries saw it, everybody in that choir had a crucifix. Where had they buried them? If you'd been caught with it, you're dead. Everybody in the audience followed the Mass, just absolutely enthralled with it. And you see, I've been through so many things where I've had to back off because freedom is so important that the people in the audience are going to be in trouble. And twice I had to cancel Russia because our ambassador said, Dave, if you come, the secret police are going to take everybody's name at the door and they'll lose all their privileges. And some of them are going to come anyway. They want to hear jazz and they want to hear you so badly. But I canceled. Then when the Russians canceled the Olympics, we canceled another tour. When the Russian plane was shot down with a Korean, I think, remember that?
Right.
We canceled again. Mm-hmm. Or they canceled us. But then, when there started to be cultural exchange, Gorbachev and Reagan were starting to be friendly. Then we're going to move again, like Eisenhower and some of the other presidents, to cultural exchange. And Russians were given a list of who they could choose to come. And we suggested, the Reagans suggested who would come. And the Russians wanted me, and Nancy Reagan wanted me to go. So we went with Air Force One, but there's 4 Air Force Ones flew.
Uh-huh. Ah, I see.
4 different planes. Mm-hmm. There were so many press people in one plane and musicians and my bunch in another plane with a lot of other people. Yeah. Was a real experience. But believe me, that room where we played was full of dissidents that Gorbachev had just let out of jail. Do you remember, if I got the name right, Sokolov?
Uh-huh.
Had just been released, and Iola was sitting next to his wife, who was, I think, a poet or a philosopher. And there were generals that had thrown these guys in jail. They're all sitting at this big room, some at the same tables, and our top diplomats were there. And it was kind of a tense thing. And then it was time for us to play. That room came together.
Well, you said it the best. Well, you said rhythm ties humanity together. Am I correct? Absolutely. Amazing story. You're one of the real ambassadors. And most appreciative that you've done that in your lifetime. I'm really interested to hear about your vision for the Institute.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, it's just grown beyond what we ever thought would happen. It started from me playing at the University of Pacific. And before the concert, the kids from the conservatory could ask me questions. And one of them said, "Where did you meet your wife?" And I was in the old conservatory where I'd been in 1938 to 42. And I said, "Coming through that door." It's the same auditorium.
Yeah.
And because I didn't say hello or anything, but I remembered seeing her. And I asked her years later, I said, "I can tell you what you were wearing." And she said, "That's right." So the next time we played there, it's a long story about the dress, because why she would remember, her parents had moved to Stockton, California, and because she was a scholarship student and they couldn't afford housing for her. So he transferred. He was in the California Forest Service. He transferred from Redding, California, down to Stockton. So the family would be living in Iola, wouldn't have to rent something because they were very poor. Mm-hmm. They lived over a dressmaker, and the dressmaker had made this dress. But the person that asked it to be made didn't show up to collect it and pay for it. So she gave it to Iola. So that's why I could describe. And she said, "Yes, that's the dress." The next year we're playing at Pacific. And the dean, Carl Nossi, came out at intermission and said, "I want to give a presentation to Dave and Iola." And a light went on the door. And there's a curtain by the door, black curtain. And the student went over and pulled the string, the curtain opens, and there's a brass plaque that says, "Coming through this door, Dave and Iola Whitlock, Dave Brubeck and Iola Whitlock started their musical life together." Well, a lot of different schools wanted my, archives.
Yes.
And even in Washington, D.C., they wanted them. And I said to myself, it's got to go here. Mm-hmm. If they remember things like this. So that's how it started, was from that door.
That's a great story.
Yeah. And that Carl Nossi retired as dean and then started the idea of the Institute and the archives. And that's all just developing. Mm-hmm. And hopefully it will get the sponsorship, because it takes a lot of money to do what J.B. Dias, that now runs the Institute, wants to do.
Yeah, he's got an agenda.
Yeah, hasn't he? And but people are starting to contribute. It's a bad time for contributions, mm-hmm. the time of this war and the economy and everything. But alumni are surprisingly giving some good gifts. Mm-hmm. And we think we can make it really. Don Walker and Daryl are okay. Daryl Morrison.
Okay.
Are putting together the archives, and every morning now I listen to what the CDs that they're going to send as a representation of their huge, they must have 250 CDs. Mm-hmm. But I'm listening to one each day. There's 6 that are going to the Kevin Starr, who is the historian for the state of California, has sponsored putting all my tape that was in this room that I never would have sent. But George and my daughter-in-law just grabbed all this stuff and sent it. So they got to go through it all. Yeah. And they found some things that I never knew about. Some I think are great, and some I wish, I wish I'd played better than that. So the first shipment was 176 legal boxes.
Oh my.
And they've cataloged them. Daryl and Don have cataloged all this stuff. If I want something, I can't find it here. I call them. They'll have it in 1 minute,
Terrific.
And there's so much more to go. All these scores got to be watched and copied, maybe so they're permanent. Because these go back to old copy machines where the paper's all crumbling and they'll carefully iron it. I don't know how they get it right.
Well, it sounds like a fun job too. A little bit like being a detective. And
Don is a musician, Don Walker, and a composer. I keep being embarrassed that this guy has more brains than I, is doing all this slave work and seems to enjoy it. I don't see how he can.
Take it as a big compliment, I think.
I guess if I had his brains, I wouldn't touch this job.
I was very happy to see they sent me some information about it.
Oh, they did?
Yes, right underneath the Institute, developing artists and audiences for the future. Very important, I think, that we have an audience too.
Yeah.
For this music. So that's encouraging to see.
Yeah. Well, let's hope it works.
Yeah. Maybe I can just wrap up and ask about your sons' careers. They seem to be going well.
There's a recording just came out last week in England with 4 of our sons and the London Symphony Orchestra. So we've got the test pressing upstairs, and I'm pleased with it. It was for my 80th birthday. When I was 70, they brought the 4 sons. When I was 75, 4 sons. 80, they bring them from all over the world because Darius is in South Africa. And Danny and Matthew are in California. Krista's a mile or so from here. And we have a big party in England on my birthday. So this recording has a piece called 4-score-in-7 by Darius. 4-score meaning my age, I think. Uh-huh. In 7 is the time signature. And they had one day to rehearse that with themselves because they just congregated. probably all of them with jet lag, and they rehearsed it, and it was very difficult. And in 7, and then the orchestra played it, and they're such great readers. Mm-hmm. But it's the kind of thing you wish you'd had a lot more time to rehearse and play, but it's on the record, and it's very good.
Good.
Darius is playing piano. We have 2 pianos on stage, 9-foot grands, and I'm sitting at the other one, and I thought, if I sit here, it's going to look like I'm playing when this guy's doing all the work. So I got up and I grabbed an orchestra chair or something that was there, so I'm far removed from the piano, and it's Darius doing all the work.
Wanted to give credit where it's due, huh?
Yeah. And then Russell Gloyd is conducting. Now we're going back and doing the Easter cantata we've decided to do. And the Upon This Rock, or we'll fill out a CD with the London Symphony Orchestra. Mm-hmm. Easily, we could fill out 3 or 4, I think.
Yeah.
But that'll be in May. And they've hired me for my 85th birthday, and all the kids.
All right, everybody's got it on their calendar. Good. You'll be there.
I hope.
Okay, this has been most fascinating. To end up, I want to just play for you a very short segment. And, you know, I write a little bit of music myself, and I've always felt that one of the greatest compliments you can get is when people play your music when you're not even there.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's what this is, but I'm sure you'll recognize it.
Let it go. What was that?
That was Jackie and Roy from about 1972 or 3.
With Paul.
With Paul.
Sounds like there's more people.
They overdubbed that little section in there, the Don Sebesky arrangements, and they hooked up Summer Song and Summertime, and he plays. It's absolutely gorgeous. Do you have it?
Must have it someplace.
Yeah.
Must. They would have sent it to me.
Yeah.
But it seems like I never heard it. Play it again.
Let's see if I can get back to the
just
beginning.
a ways.
This is the middle section of the piece.
God, every day I listen to this old stuff from the archives at Pacific, and it gets me so emotional to hear.
Well, you have a legacy of music that is unprecedented, I think, in the kind of person you are seems to go along with it in perfect tandem. So I just want to thank you for your time today. It's been an honor for me and to to be with you, and I wish you the best. And I'm going to book my flight to London for your 85th.
Oh, I hope I make it.
I'm sure you will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.